I'm speaking about Robert Blackburn today, who's a printmaker born in 1920 and died in 2003, whose work is in the collection of the Bronx Museum and presented downstairs. Robert Blackburn is most frequently mentioned as a teacher and master printer. Yeah. Discussions of his own artistic accomplishments always include the creation of the printmaking workshop, the collaborative graphic studio he founded in New York in 1947, which still operates today. Blackburn was a key artist in the development of printmaking in the 20th century in the United States. His own artwork traces passages from the Harlem Renaissance, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's work progress administration of the 1930s, to the Art Students League and the New York School, to Paris, and back to his famous graphic studio in New York, to Universal Limited Art Editions, known as ULAE, through the graphic explosion of the 1960s and the proliferation of collaborative nonprofit workspaces in the early 1970s and the rise of multiculturalism in the 80s. All the while, he produced work of astonishing relevance that is little known for over 60 years, while he directed this vibrant and collaborative workspace that welcomed thousands of artists from around the world. Today, I'd like to speak about selected Blackburn artworks so that you may know them, and we'll look at the various communities in which Blackburn was involved or which he created, and which fostered his lifelong belief in art making as community. In the middle of World War I, the SS Manochial arrived on Ellis Island in 1917. Of the 20 passengers on board from Jamaica, Jeanette Chambers of Montego Bay met Robert Blackburn, Blackburn's father, from Kingston. The two would marry, have 2 children, and separate shortly thereafter in New York. While his mother encouraged his early artistic talents and was a very warm, expansive woman, a very patient woman, as Blackburn said, his father was never very particularly interested in me and my art. Blackburn's uncle, a house painter, had met the famous Harlem artist and teacher Charles Alston, who encouraged the uncle to bring young Blackburn to the 135th Street Library in Harlem, where he taught in an arts program. Thus, Blackburn entered a network of very important Harlem art classes, after-school activities, and art workshops. He said, "It kept me off the streets because I was part of a gang, and I was always pulled away from my interest in art, but I was pulled away, but my interest in art was stronger." Between 1934 and 1939, from ages 13 to 18, Blackburn came into contact with all the notable professional Harlem artists, such as Charles Alston, James Baldwin, Romar Bearden, Gwendolyn Bennett, Ernest Critchlow, County Cunlin, and on, many who are pictured in this photograph. And within this group, he found lifelong friends, father figures, and a positive family image. He said, "I was closer to these people than to my own family." From 1936 until 1939, Blackburn attended DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. At the same time, the WPA federal art program began under US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Blackburn was too young to have been on any official payrolls, but he did take free printmaking classes in Harlem offered through the WPA at the Harlem Community Arts Center, the WPA's largest New York facility. Prior to this, fine art graphics facilities had been unavailable to the Black community. At the Harlem Community Arts Center in 1938, he learned lithography, primarily with Riva Helfont. There, he, Helfont, and the artist Ronald Joseph forged a close artistic and personal alliance. His enthusiastic embrace of the elaborate process of stone lithography was extremely unusual for a young Black artist in 1930s Harlem. Blackburn's early artistic style was most obviously influenced by Mexican muralism, social realism, and regionalist scene painting. We can see his work in reproductions from The Magpie, his high school art and literary journal, such as on the end papers here from the 1937 January volume, that combine influences of Thomas Hart Benton, Aaron Douglas, Diego Rivera, and his teacher, Charles Alston. Alston had visited Rivera at work on his infamous and later destroyed 1933 mural in Rockefeller Center, and Alston later created his own Harlem murals while running the only WPA mural program in New York, which included Black artists. Blackburn was also clearly absorbing the lessons of the Mexican muralists. In this ode to his hardworking mother, he employs the heroic types popular in both Mexican and social realist work. Less than 10 known prints were produced by Blackburn at the Harlem Community Arts Center while he was in high school, and a few were reproduced in the Magpie. One of his most well-developed and well-known lithographic images from this time, Refugees, is related to widespread Depression-era imagery of displacement and migration. The image responds to a series of freakish storms and floods that occurred that year in the northeastern, southern, and western parts of the United States, which were broadly reported through the media. It also obviously alludes to images of the Underground Railroad and the African-American migrations northwards after slavery ended and during the Reconstruction period. Blackburn was also an admirer of Max Beckmann, and we can see some relationship to Beckmann's departure triptych from the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. After his graduation, he received a scholarship to the Art Students League. That same year, Blackburn, Romar Bearden, Jacob Lawrence, Ronald Joseph, and writers William Attaway and Claude McKay each paid $8 a month for their share of an unheated loft in Harlem on West 125th Street. Bearden and Lawrence would become the two most successful and exhibited Black artists in the United States in the 20th century. Blackburn enrolled at the Art Students League in 1940 when he was nearly 20 and studied there until 1943. In his first 2 years, he studied with Václav Vytlačil, a Czech painter who had met earlier in Harlem. Vytlačil brought ideas about abstraction and modernism to Harlem, including Braque and Picasso. Blackburn was moving away from his interest in social realism and Mexican modernism and towards Cubism and modern European painting. In his third year, Blackburn studied with Will Barnett on Saturdays. In 1934, Barnett was the Art Students League professional printer, and by 1936, its youngest faculty member. Blackburn studied with Barnett and worked as his assistant. Slowly, the relationship evolved from teacher-pupil to colleagues, as the two quickly focused on the untapped possibilities of the medium. Barnett has said, "We wanted the stone and what we did on the stone to express the same ideals as painting. We used the stone in a very free way. They experimented, digging into the stone much like a mezzotint. The stone became a very manipulated thing, like a drawing," Barnett said. Around this time, Blackburn approached George Miller, the best-known lithographic printer for artists, asking for technical information. Blackburn recalls his disappointment when Miller responded, "Young man, if you want to learn anything from me, you'll have to spend $100 a week, and then I'll teach you something." Of course, Blackburn did not have such financial resources. Leaving Harlem was difficult, but he was determined to be at the center of the art scene, not in its periphery. On different occasions, he tried to express what downtown signified to him. He remembers taking the elevated train, from Harlem to the New York Aquarium in Coney Island, riding over what he called the white world, but never stopping in between. He said, "People had more money than I did, and more freedom. I still remember these feelings of being a little frightened of the whole scene." During and just after World War II, the sense of experimentation was reinforced by surrealists fleeing Europe for New York. They greatly affected American artists and the abstract expressionists. For printmakers, Stanley William Hayter's Atelier 17 was their home. Originally founded in Paris in 1927, all the major modern European artists went to work with Hayter, a British-born intaglio master. Hayter relocated his workshop to New York in 1940. After the war in 1950, he returned to Paris. While many of the artists in Hayter's New York studio were foreign-born immigrants, they exchanged ideas with a variety of American artists. Although Blackburn had never formally studied with Hayter, he knew Hayter and many of the artists who worked there very well and would visit the workshop. Hayter's creation of a diverse and dynamic and experimental social community resonated with Blackburn. Hayter commented on the social importance of his own workshop. He said, "Many of them met one another in my workshop because the situation in New York, well, they were howling in the wilderness. They were having a very tough time, working in the most squalid of lofts on East 10th Street. There was no place where they could easily get together, where they could meet one another." But despite the mingling of groups in these very special places, racial barriers still divided the larger world. Blackburn never felt fully involved with what he calls the Cedar Bar Crowd, and printmaking was considered a secondary technique, suitable for reproductions, but not real art. Of course, economic disenfranchisement for Black artists was a reality. If people had served in World War II, they were eligible for the GI Bill to pay for schooling, but if they did not serve, and Blackburn did not, they had no hope. They could only try for a few grants that were possible for Black artists at that time, the Julius Rosenwald Fund or the John Hay Whitney Fellowships. Between 1943 and 47, Blackburn held various odd jobs and had no access to a press. The prospects for an African-American artist to explore experimental abstract color lithography were very bleak. This situation compelled Robert Blackburn to create his own means. By late October 1947, he acquired his own press and relocated to a large loft on West 17th Street with 4 other artists. After a day at work, he worked from 5 p.m. until 2 a.m. on his own lithopress. One by one, as the others moved out of his loft, he kept the space to himself, took on more edition printing for other artists, and working for a gallery. He opened his home studio to a core group of artists, friends and friends of friends. From the beginning, it was an eclectic mix. His Black friends, progressive liberal artists, a few foreigners, many women. He made everyone welcome and gave them a possibility to work even if they had no artistic market. Blackburn, Will Barnett, John von Wicht, a German-born printmaker, and a few others shared his enthusiasm for pushing the boundaries of lithography. One of the founding members of the workshop, Tom Laidman, who's the tall gentleman in the middle, who worked with Bob at his workshop until Tom's death in 2010, recalled, "When I came there in 1950, the shop was on West 17th Street in a 4-story red brick building. There was no elevator, and everything in the place went up on our backs, including the presses, stones, lumber for building, coal for the stove in the middle of the shop. We froze in the winter, roasted in the summer, and the heat didn't make the printing any easier. We went through all kinds of maneuvers to keep the images in the stones from filling in. The atmosphere was friendly and intimate. There was an open arrangement whereby students and artists had unlimited access. There were 3 or 4 lithopresses, and we'd all fight for press time. Bob was a dynamo of energy." There is very little work from the early and mid-40s from which to study Blackburn's evolving style. However, the few prints that do exist show his transition from figuration to abstraction and a strong interest in color. He said, "Color was something we didn't understand, didn't know how to put into lithography. We didn't even have the colors. I used to have to run around and find people who could make colors with the quality you need for a good print lithograph. In America, we were not doing color printing at that time." Nonetheless, Blackburn was quickly developing a reputation for color lithographic excellence. One excellent example of his masterful handling is his 1950 Girl in Red. While it is a testament to his technical skill, what is most intriguing is its subject matter. A color print that deals with race, a young female Black subject looks directly at the viewer. On one level, it's a classic portrait, a subject before an open window, a tabletop still life in front, but this is a very distinctive model. A young sophisticate, quite at home in her country surrounds, neatly attired and insouciantly leaning on her elbow. Such a subject with such body language must have been a bit startling in the segregated 1950s in the United States. His still life is the first of many still lifes that he would begin to create over the next 15 years. We can see his rapidly developing fluidity in the medium. Blackburn finally succeeded in his application for a John Hay Whitney Traveling Fellowship. He went to Paris to follow 2 great traditions: African-American artists who traveled to Paris to find equality, and enlightened artist printmakers who went to Paris to make modernist color prints. He went to Atelier des Joubert, but became immediately frustrated. The fellowship period was not fruitful artistically, but he said, "I just wanted to relax. I was able to sit in a cafe, which I had never been able to do, and just look at people pass and wander the streets." With his money running out at the end of 1954, He sold his motorbike and went back home. In New York, artist Chaim Koppelman had taken the initiative of helping to transform the studio into a loose cooperative where artists paid an annual fee to guarantee ongoing expenses. But in Blackburn's absence, they struggled. After a creative dry period in Europe, his homecoming provoked an outpouring of graphic work. He worked and reworked still life themes, producing a series of small cubistic tabletop views in both intaglio and lithography, in which the subject is treated both realistically and abstractly. Blackburn's repeated return to cubistic still life compositions defines the art historical lineage with which he most identified, beginning with Cézanne, moving through the European modernist figures such as Braque and Gris. He poured out all that he experienced abroad in the museums and galleries, again and again, repeatedly employing the still life as an automatic format that allowed him to explore color, mark-making, and structure while sidestepping problems brought to the fore by figurative work and their attendant and weighty messages, particularly for African American artists in the United States. Between 1958 and 1961, Blackburn worked on variations of the lithograph, heavy forms, culminating in a small edition. Proofs exist in at least 20 versions, each printed in a unique order. Blackburn also needed work for which he got paid. Thus, from 1957 into 1963, he was hired to work as the first master printer for another new print shop called Universal Limited Art Editions, located in Long Island. Although he took the job for the paycheck, commuting from the city on the train, he was inspired by the artwork he encountered and found a kindred spirit in the director of that workshop, Tatiana Grossman, a Russian-American printmaker like Riva Helfand, his first teacher. Blackburn's own work was beginning to explore the contemporary artistic concerns of his time, such as those pertinent to action painting, neo-dada, or pop art. Like the painters of the New York School, Blackburn's arena was the stone's surface, bearing the traces of struggle and process. He defied the idea of lithography as faithfully reproducing a rigid, identical print edition. His own works never even arrived at editions at all, and his works primarily exist in multiple state color proofs, themes and their variations. He relished the process. In this, his work relates to his contemporaries, such as Robert Rauschenberg or Andy Warhol. Blackburn's thinking was becoming horizontal, across the surface of the stone as he moved around it while it lay on the press bed. This interpretation can hardly be avoided when we think of how a printmaker actually works, the relationship to the table, to the stone, the plate, the block, or the press. In his 1972 essay, Leo Steinberg coined the expression, the flatbed picture plane, to describe this radical shift in orientation that he saw crystallized in the work of Robert Rauschenberg. Steinberg's metaphor neatly described a move away from the bodily experiential model of all prior Western art, which referred to a window facing the body on an easel or a wall, and moved it down towards a horizontal, cluttered workspace of the table, while also giving pride of place to printmaking as a discipline. Ironically, the first artist Tatiana Grossman invited had a deep distaste for printmaking. Few had ever even tried printmaking before. Larry Rivers complained, "One needed the patience of another age." And Rauschenberg famously said, "I thought the second half of the 20th century was no time to start drawing on rocks." The artists who would go on to define the American graphics boom of the early 1960s were in capable hands. Blackburn had been thinking in print for over 20 years. His sensibility informed them how to approach the stone, and his deep knowledge of the medium taught them what was possible. As well, the invigorating collaborations at ULE also artistically stimulated Blackburn. Over the 5 years he worked there, he printed the first 79 editions for ULAE, including works for Jim Dine, Sam Francis, Helen Frankenthaler, Fritz Glarner, Robert Goodnow, Grace Hartigan, Jasper Johns, Robert Motherwell, Robert Rauschenberg, and Larry Rivers. Robert Rauschenberg began working at ULAE in 1962. By 1963, Blackburn was attempting to extricate himself from the overwhelming workload and return to his own printmaking studio. But then a critical moment occurred while printing a Rauschenberg project. After a few impressions, the stone broke into pieces. Both the stone and the proofs were discarded. Rauschenberg then made another image on another stone, and it was proofed, and it broke in after three impressions. Rauschenberg placed the two fragments back on the press bed, added another stone he called the debris, and printed the edition. The edition was printed, and its title, Accident. It was later submitted to the International Print Exhibition in Ljubljana, Yugoslavia, where it won the 1963 Grand Prize and became the seminal image of the American graphic explosion and the new printmaking's rupture with its past. Despite the prestige this work eventually achieved, it was related that the event, quote, shook Blackburn's confidence. However, as a seasoned printmaker, he knew that stones sometimes cracked, and eventually ULAE had to make a new press bed. However, around the same time, Blackburn produced Faux Pas. A white stripe of paper breaks the image, alluding to the fragile objecthood of the limestone. The bipartite composition and the work's title, I believe, winks with a reference to the important fracture that would become such a key event in the history of contemporary printmaking, as well as Blackburn's intimate relationship to it. After ULAE, Bob went back to his workshop and worked on modest lithographs, woodcuts, and intaglios. He started teaching to earn money and worked at Columbia University among many others. In 1971, Blackburn decided to transition his private workshop from a private endeavor to a publicly funded institution. The Printmaking Workshop was incorporated as an official, not-for-profit organization that was eligible for grants and donations in 1971. The Printmaking Workshop was a hybrid, combining the best of all that had influenced him: the WPA's Harlem Community Arts Center, Barnett's shop at the Art Students League, Hayter's Atelier 17, and ULAE. The incorporated workshop solidified Blackburn's vision, and he worked to create clear programs. The Printmaking Workshop was well known for its open, informal, and accommodating atmosphere. Artists dropped in continuously to visit with Blackburn. At the same time that Blackburn's was finally incorporated, many other printmaking efforts in the United States were initiated following his example. For example, in New York in 1969, El Taller Alma Boricua was founded in El Barrio. Marcos Dimas and Fernando Salicrup, both Puerto Ricans, studied with Blackburn at School of Visual Arts after they both returned from service in Vietnam in the late 1960s. They took his example to heart and founded a workshop for the Puerto Rican community in El Barrio in 1970. Blackburn's door was always open to Caribbean and Latino artists, and many Puerto Ricans worked in his shop, including Nestor Otero, Juan Sanchez, Nitza Tufino, Juan Sanchez, among many others. In 1997, Diogenes Ballester, who served as the president of the jury of the 12th San Juan Biennale of Latin American and Caribbean Printmaking of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture in San Juan, brought Blackburn to Puerto Rico for the first time to serve on the jury. Ballester worked with Blackburn from 1981 when he first arrived in New York. Many Cubans also worked at the shop since its incorporation in 1971, particularly during the 70s and 80s. These include Roberto Estopiñan, Hugo Consuegra, Gladys Triana, Juan Bosa, and Eduardo Roca Choco Salazar, a key figure since the 1970s, as you all know, from Taller Experimental de Gráfica. In 1995, the workshop officially collaborated with Altos de Chavon, La Romana, and the Museo de Arte Moderno in Santo Domingo, La República Dominicana, opening communications and hosting a flow of artists, including Grecia Rivera Fis, Julio Valdez, Sherazad Garcia, and many, many others. This effort with the Dominican Republic has in a certain way spawned a new project in New York called the Dominican York Proyecto Gráfica, founded in 2010, including several of the artists who had come through Blackburn's workshop. Although La República does not have a long tradition of printmaking, such as Cuba or Puerto Rico, the new effort refers to this larger shared history. As we have seen, from its beginnings, the printmaking workshop attracted practitioners from diverse artistic and cultural backgrounds, and it was as much about creating community against all odds as it was about creating artwork. Blackburn noted in an interview, "I think most of our learning was sitting down at the coffee table with Van Vicht and Barnett and Ronald Joseph, drinking coffee and working together, and that's why I believe in that." Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell noted Bob Blackburn created the pluralistic community. When the workshop was incorporated over a long period of time through the early 80s, Blackburn slowly worked on his own small and large-scale woodcuts, like his lithographs, that were complex, transformational, and self-referential. Other influences were also felt at the workshop. By 1968, the Indian artist Krishna Reddy, who Blackburn had met in Paris, was teaching at the printmaking workshop. Reddy was renowned for his advancement of viscosity printmaking techniques in his work at Stanley William Hayter's in Paris. By working and teaching at the printmaking workshop, Reddy introduced viscosity printing to American printmakers. Blackburn himself took Reddy's classes, which were offered through the 1970s. In Krishna's classes, Blackburn made his own viscosity print called Experiment in 1979. In 2001, he produced a second edition of this intaglio. He also produced a number of small etchings when he was invited in 1978 to help found the Asila Printmaking Workshop as part of an annual summer festival in Morocco. Blackburn, along with a contingent of printmaking workshop artists, traveled to Morocco to set it up and run it. Later, in the mid-80s, he returned with representatives for a second visit. Around the same time, monoprinting also came to the printmaking workshop through Romar Bearden. Between 1974 and 83, the two collaborated on the production of Bearden's monotypes at the printmaking workshop. Nearly 100 prints printed on Saturdays and occasional Sundays. As one of the leading African-American artists, Bearden's legacy strongly impacted the printmaking workshop community. He was filmed for a public television documentary in the workshop, and there was tremendous excitement whenever he printed there. Many artists at the printmaking workshop tested Bearden's stencil monotype method and developed upon it. Even Blackburn himself did an experimental suite of approximately 10 monoprints between 1976 and 84 with paper stencils, some with titles including Fear and What is Apartheid. These seemingly political images go in a very different direction than Bearden's joyous compositions and contemplate international politics and globalism. Late in his life, Blackburn accepted several opportunities to work in other sites. In 1988, he traveled to Sweden for an exhibition and produced this lithograph, Stockholm There. In 1989, he was a guest artist at the Fabric Workshop in Philadelphia, where he created large-scale seriographs on linen. In 2000, he created an etching on handmade paper for Dieudonné Paper Mill in New York. In 2001, at the age of 80, after a period of financial hardship, aggravated by increasing health problems and an impatient landlord, Blackburn made the difficult decision to close the printmaking workshop. However, he had already entered into discussions with the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts to take on his workshop as one of its programs, where it was renamed the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop. In 2002, he was commissioned to design mosaics for the MTA 116th Street, Lexington Avenue, No. 6 subway station in New York. He created 6 collages that extracted imagery and colors from his lifetime of work in collaboration with the artist Maitai Singh Smith for transformation into 12 elaborate glass mosaics. Regrettably, Robert Blackburn passed in 2003 and did not live to see the lyrical installation, Untitled, In Everything There Is a Season, completed in 2005. The 12 mosaics stand permanently in New York as a compendium of all his iconography in the city he embraced in all its facets. Robert Blackburn produced a fascinating and engaging body of work over more than 60 years. Indeed, his work is hard to categorize, and unfortunately, he was not incredibly prolific, as he was always working on so many other aspects of the print world. Yet his life cuts an incredible passage from the Harlem Renaissance up to our contemporary times. Thank you.